A frightful despotism. That's what George Washington predicted we'd get with a combination of rule by factions, constant usurpations of power and consolidation or centralized power, which I think describes exactly what we live under today. Now, he was far from alone. Many other founders warned against this scenario, which I think has been ripe for all kinds of political violence for a long, long time. But they didn't leave us hanging. They also gave us a fix. It's very straightforward stuff, a solution to the insanity that we live under today. On this episode, I've got all that and more. And if you've never heard George Washington's warnings and prediction, this is pretty awesome stuff. But first of all, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the path to liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Monday, July 15th, 2024. Now, before getting into some detail on the cause and fix for what everyone seems to be calling political violence these days, here's an important reminder from Benjamin Franklin during the Philadelphia Convention, the summer of 1787, about the nature of government power, which I believe is the underlying issue we face all day, every day. Franklin, like so many of the other founders, was a much better student of history than almost every one of us alive today. And here's how he put it. All history informs us. There has been in every state and kingdom a constant kind of warfare between the governing and the governed. So I think that's really the underlying issue. But it also leads to all kinds of other stuff. And whether people grasp it or not, the result is the bigger the government, the worse the powers they exercise, the more unconstitutional acts they do, the more usurpations of power or arbitrary power, as they called it in the Declaration of Independence, the more that people devolve into parties or factions so they can be on the winning side controlling power over the other team. Mercy Otis Warren put it like this in her great history of the American Revolution. Thomas Jefferson thought it was amazing stuff. History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution. It's chapter 31. It'll be linked to in the show notes. She said, both history and experience have proved that when party feuds have thus divided a nation, urbanity and benevolence are laid aside. Sounds kind of soft, but she gets a little more hardcore here as well. She said, and influenced by the most malignant and corrupt passions, they lose sight of the sacred obligations of virtue until there appears little difference in the ferocious spirits of men in the most refined and civilized society or among the rude and barbarous hordes of the wilderness. So she says when party feuds divide a nation, eventually we turn into barbarians. Humanity really is after each other, on top of each other's throats almost constantly. And we see this all around us. Every issue is a political issue because, well, every issue devolves down to one or two people making the decision for hundreds of millions of people. It's really, really bad stuff. Now, interestingly enough, Mercy in her book there, she was lamenting the shift in principles, the fall from grace that she had seen over the years in her longtime friend, John Adams. But back when he was one of the good guys, he certainly understood this danger as well. And he said, there is nothing which I dread so much as a division of the republic into two great parties, each arranged under its leader and concerting measures in opposition to each other. So Adams understood, just like Mercy Otis Warren, and we'll see from George Washington here as well, that, well, when you're dividing, if everything is just party first, party based, it's one side versus the other on anything and everything, social, religious, economic, political viewpoints, all one or the other, one side or the other, trying to control the entire system, well, then that's all it is. There are no other principles. And we can see how that people can flip-flop based on who does what as well. Anyways, the important question, I think, is what leads to this kind of scenario? On the one hand, Mercy Otis Warren, she pointed out that there is some kind of a natural tendency towards this. And she said there is a propensity in mankind to enlist themselves under the authority of names and to adopt the opinions of men of celebrity more from the fashion of the times than from the convictions of reason. Celebrities' power back in the 18th and early 19th century. We don't think of it like that, but Mercy Otis Warren understood it as well. She said, thus, with the borrowed language of their chieftain, They impose upon themselves until they think his opinions are their own, and are often wrought up to such a fierce spirit of contention that they appear ready to defend them in all the cruel modes of a savage, who is seldom actuated by motives of candor and forgiveness of injuries. So it's bash the side over the head, only take for your own view whatever the boss of your team is saying, or basically the party structure today, and turn into a cruel savage going after each other until, well, things get really, really bad. Here, Thomas Gordon, who was one of the authors of Cato's Letters in the early 18th century, one of the most widely read sets of documents by the founding generation, the old revolutionaries. He also wrote something called The Works of Sallust in 1744, also widely read and very influential. He put it this way: "It is with measures as with men. They are praised or condemned, not because they are right or wrong, beneficial or hurtful, but because they come from this party or the other." We hear this all the time. And in fact, many people today take a position that you're good or bad based on where you live, like where your family is. And so if you live in the wrong state or the wrong country, you must be a socialist or a bad guy, or vice versa. You're a fascist and a bad guy. "Evil is turned to good," wrote Gordon, "and good into evil. Truth passes for falsehood. Falsehood is dressed up in the guise of truth. The best actions are decried as the worst if they arise from one quarter. The worst actions adored as the best if from the other." So he's recognizing all the way back in 1744, and this was a long period of history, he recognized, just like Mercy Otis Warren did years later, that this is what humanity kind of does. They devolve into this mindless, lower level of being when they focus on party first over their own individual thoughts. You lose your individuality. George Washington, in his farewell address, specifically said, if you have a permanent attachment to another nation, your nation no longer is free. You're no longer independent. And I think we can apply the same principles to our humanity. If we don't think independently and attached to a party or an individual and just support them or oppose them based on whatever they do because the other side is worse or whatever our reasoning is, we're no longer independent, sovereign creatures, I guess, on our own. Now, on the other hand, there are attempts to prevent this type of thing, recognizing the founders recognized this propensity in history and in mankind, this fatal flaw of humanity, I guess. And here's how Thomas Paine put it. He said, "It is the nature and intention of a constitution to prevent governing by party." That's the point for Thomas Paine, is to prevent this faction-first approach. He said, "By establishing a common principle that shall limit and control the power and impulse of the party, and that says to all parties, thus far shalt thou go and no farther." All caps from Thomas Paine in this one, his dissertation on the first principles of government. But, he said, in the absence of a constitution, men look entirely to party. And instead of principle governing party, party governs principle. So it's party first, principle, and then maybe constitution at the bottom, or rules of sound principles at the bottom. Now, if you don't have a constitution at all, certainly that wouldn't even be in the list. But here's how Gordon put it as well. He said, "Party principles are therefore substituted for moral principles, the sure way to destroy all morality and to confound the characters of men and even those of good and evil." So, in truth, he said, morality with sense is the only true standard of popularity. Morality with sense, not just being on one team or another. Now, even if you have a written constitution, it might be just in name only. And I think that's really the situation we're living under today. Certainly, we have a written constitution, but it's almost constantly violated 24/7, 365. So what's the difference of having none? Paine put it like this in Rights of Man, Part 2. He said, "All power exercised over a nation must have some beginning. It must either be delegated or assumed. There are no other sources. All delegated power is trust, and all assumed power is usurpation." Now, Paine, like the founders and the old revolutionaries widely understood, is that all power flows from the people. The people hold final authority or sovereignty, and government is merely their agent to do what the people determine that they want the government to do. It doesn't matter what system of government you have. That's how the founders and the old revolutionaries looked at it. The British, of course, vehemently disagreed. It led to a long, bloody war of secession for independence that, well, the empire lost. James Madison, a number of years later, said the British claim to power over the colonies in all cases whatsoever, taught them that they end up having power over the colonies in no cases whatsoever. Just a quick aside there. But I would argue that any scenario like what we live under today, where usurpation of power, and usurpation is the founder's term for a theft of power. It's stealing power from the sovereign people of the several states. It's an exercise of power that government is not authorized to exercise. We can list all kinds of acts, laws, rules, regulations, and orders that should never exist, but they are on the books today, and the government loves adding more to them. So I would make the case that where usurpation is the norm, just like we have right now, it's the same, if not worse, than not having a constitution at all. What's the point? And I think that's why George Washington warned us in his farewell address, which I'm going to be highlighting quite a bit here, against usurpation of power. He said, "It is important, likewise, that the habits of It's important, likewise, that the habits of thinking in a free country should inspire caution in those entrusted with its administration to confine themselves within their respective constitutional spheres, avoiding in the exercise of the powers of one department to encroach upon another." And I guess we should also point out anything that they're not even authorized in the first place. It's not just about the judiciary exercising the legislative branch or executive orders legislating with a pen, or there's so many different versions of this back and forth, but it's also any power that's not been delegated to them. He said the spirit of encroachment, this spirit of trying to go beyond their limits, even if it's just small things, small steps over time, he said it tends to consolidate the powers of all the departments in one, and thus to create whatever form of government, a real despotism. Now, for George Washington, he said usurpations of power, ignoring the limits of the Constitution, leads to this consolidated system, a centralized state, a real despotism. And that's why he hit it again just a few paragraphs later. There's a lot in this farewell address. And he said, even if you like what they're trying to do, also oppose the usurpation of power. So many times we hear things from one side or the other. Oh, well, the Constitution is outdated on blank, on war powers. We can't wait for a declaration of war from Congress because, it's a dangerous situation. That's archaic. We can't follow that. A bump stock, I don't use a bump stock. Why should I care that the executive branch decided to do that? That's just a kiddie toy. So you shouldn't turn a blind eye if you don't care about it, if it seems to be a small issue, or if you actually like the approach. George Washington put it like this. He said, let there be no change. If you don't like the powers of the Constitution, if you think they need to have more, use the amendment process, is what Washington said. He said, let there be no change by usurpation. For though this, in one instance, may be the instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. Now, maybe free governments is an oxymoron, but they were using it to describe a system like they tried to set up under the Articles and under the Constitution and many of the state constitutions. But he called this type of an action, even if you like the results, a weapon. So every single time they are using power that they're not authorized to use, they are waging a war. Just like Benjamin Franklin, he said, there's all through history. It has been kind of a warfare between the governing and the governed. And George Washington understood this as well a few years later, pointing out, this is in 1796, the same type of thing. When they go beyond their limits, they are using a weapon against you. Now, all this stuff is going to be linked to in the show notes. I'm covering a lot of ground in this episode, but I'm still really just scratching the surface. More important than anything, I encourage you to read through George Washington's farewell address. Normally, I try to cover that in September, but I thought this was so important to discuss it again earlier in the year. Alan Mosley does a great job of organizing a blog post for every single episode of this show. I get it published over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty a couple of hours after the live stream is done. And there you're going to find not only all the different links that I'm mentioning in this episode, plus you're going to find all the different platforms we're on. Of course, we live stream on the big ones, the mainstream ones like X and YouTube and Facebook and Twitch and LinkedIn. We also live stream at Odyssey.com and Rumble.com, and I appreciate everyone joining us, whatever platform you're on. I see Brewster out there. And Jug, thank you for your support. David Santiago, Channel 3, Howard Clegg, and a number of other people. I appreciate you all being here, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. But again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty is where you're going to find the blog post with all the stuff that I'm mentioning in this episode, like Cato's third anti-federalist letter in 1787. Now, before getting more into George Washington's prediction, I think it should make sense why, and I want to cite a few other people here as well, why a consolidated system in a huge country with a wide range of political, social, economic, and religious views can only result in factions vying for power and control over the other. If you only have one choice when there's 10 different views, people will kind of try to align with the one choice that is at least the least furthest from their views, and then you get this back and forth thing that, Washington's prediction on is pretty awesome. But here's how Cato put it. He said, whoever seriously considers the immense extent of territory comprehended with the limits of the United States, together with the variety of its climates, productions, and commerce, the difference of extent and number of inhabitants in all, the dissimilitude of interest, morals, and politics in almost everyone, will receive it as an intuitive truth that a consolidated republican form of government therein can never form a perfect union, establish justice, ensure domestic tranquility, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty to you and your posterity. So he's taking kind of a hit at the preamble to the Constitution, which was, of course, drafted by Gouverneur Morris. But he's saying, this is impossible. And even under a system that would have been much more limited at the time, in a much smaller geographic area at the time, in comparison to a massive country, which is supposed to be a union of sovereign states, not a singular nation. There's no way, with such a wide variety of viewpoints. We think of the founding generation. Oh, well, John Adams at one point said 13 clocks struck as one. He pointed out that the views of the people were very similar, but this was very rare in history. And by the time the Constitution was being drafted, you could see a lot of these viewpoints widening. And he's talking about the politics of the people were widely different in different parts of the country, and there's no way to have a consolidated system without a tyranny. He said, for these objects, it must be directed. An unkindred legislature, therefore, composed of interests opposite and dissimilar in their nature, will in its exercise emphatically be like a house divided against itself. We absolutely should pay attention to the warnings of people like George Washington, but also the warnings of the anti-federalists. Now, we may not know who all of them are, but some of the perspectives that they were sharing, that over time, this is how it's going to play out, they almost seem prophetic. A house divided against itself. And I think that's a great example of what we live under today. Samuel Adams had a very similar take in a letter to Elbridge Gerry in 1789. He said, I am fully persuaded that the population of the United States, living in different climates, now this is not a weather climate, he's not talking about climate change, but different kind of environments. I am fully persuaded that the population of the United States, living in different climates, of different education and manners, and possessed of different habits and feelings, under one consolidated government, cannot long remain free, or indeed remain under any kind of government but despotism. So, Samuel Adams, Cato, George Washington. I'm going to get to James Madison and a few others in a moment. Noah Webster has some awesome stuff. But back to George Washington's prediction of what would happen under a system of usurpation of power, centralizing over time, leading to government by faction and force, really. He said, the alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. I think Washington, he's even understating what we live under today, but certainly this back and forth, this revenge, I'm only out to get the right, I'm only out to get the left, whatever they say is wrong, whatever my team says is right, even if my team says is what they did a few years ago. And that's exactly what we have today. Most people don't even admit when they're doing it. They just think party first, unfortunately. But hopefully by pointing this out, maybe some people will start to slow down and think about what they're doing in these situations. This is a frightful despotism, literally just going back and forth, team A to team B, team red to team blue, back and forth, revenge sharpened by a spirit of revenge. That in and of itself, to George Washington, was a frightful despotism. But wait, there's more, because he thinks it can still even get worse. He said, but this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual. And sooner or later, the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. It really is an endless cycle, this notion of faction, consolidation, tyranny. Maybe it's consolidation, faction, tyranny. I don't know. Well, it's a chicken versus the egg situation. But as a student of history, James Madison understood this as well. And here he is in the Virginia Ratifying Convention. Again, this will be linked to in the show notes, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Also a student of history, James Madison. He said, on a candid examination of history, we shall find that turbulence, violence, and abuse of power by the majority trampling on the rights of the minority have produced factions and commotions, which in republics have more frequently than any other cause produced despotism. Madison is recognizing that an abuse of power, so an exercise of power not delegated to government, usurpations of power, unwarranted power, as Noah Webster, who I'll get to in a moment, called it. He said this leads to factions because it's all about one side or the other trying to control the system of power. And he said if we go over the whole history of ancient and modern republics, we shall find their destruction to have generally resulted from those causes. The great cause of our problem today is centralized power that was never authorized to a central government that never should exist in the form that it is today. Now, George Washington thought that under the system of the Constitution, this was an extreme scenario that might not play out for a long, long time. But he still thought it was plausible, and he thought it was worth worrying about, even though he didn't want to alarm people that this was happening immediately, and maybe he was just being kind of chill about it. But he certainly said it was plausible. He said, without looking forward to an extremity of this kind, which nevertheless ought not to be entirely out of sight, the common and continual mischiefs of the spirit of party are sufficient to make it the interest and duty of a wise people to discourage and restrain it. He said it agitates the community with ill-found jealousies and false alarms, kindles the animosity of one part against another, foments occasionally riot and insurrection. And so this is what George Washington is pointing out. This is what happens. Mercy Otis Warren, of course, she also pointed out it leads people to act like barbarians, to act like hordes and savages. And certainly, I think we're just really scratching the surface of that type of behavior today, but I think it will only get worse. Now, Noah Webster, writing about the revolution in France, and if you think about the revolution in America, was kind of, they at first kind of tried to carry it out a little bit in France, but it turned into a kind of a bloody mess, a nightmare. And Noah Webster was very concerned about this. And writing about that in 1794, he saw the combination of unconstitutional. He started out his essay with a little preview, and he said, hey, this unwarrantable exercise of power by these groups leads us to faction, which gives us a death to liberty. He said, whether a federal or an indivisible republic is the best form for France, he's like, well, let's look at this. It's not us to know. We don't know. He said, but power and not argument or experience has decided the question for the present. So the problem is that the decision made over what was happening was done by power and force. And he called it right at the beginning, unwarrantable power. He said it is the precise mode in which the Roman emperors decided Christianity to be dangerous. The precise mode in which the Chinese emperors reasoned to justify the expulsion of Christians from their dominions. And a mode which a violent ruling faction always employs to silence opposition. So it is always about power and then factions trying to control that power and using that power with violence against their opposition. And if we're not seeing too much of that violence yet, we shouldn't be surprised if we start seeing more of it and more of it in the years to come. As Webster warned, he said, nothing is more dangerous to the cause of truth and liberty than a party spirit. Then, now, if you think about what's been happening in more modern times, when you add in all of this stuff that we have, which is all kinds of power that shouldn't exist, we live under the largest government in the history of the world. That is nothing even remotely close to the system of the founding generation. What James Madison described in Federalist 45 as the federal government would only have powers that were few and defined, and those reserved to the people of the states would be numerous and indefinite. It really is the other way around, completely flipped around. So when you take that, then people start devolving into factions and choose everything based on which team rather than, straight ticket voting, whatever it may be. They just choose a team. They don't think about anything, and they can even choose a team that may just seem less bad than the other side, but then they're still bad. They're still exercising power never delegated to them in the Constitution. So then when you add on top of that, all kinds of rhetoric that we hear, that one faction is totally corrupt and evil, one party is totally evil and nasty, and and the other, even when they're bad, they may be just misguided. We just need to get a few other people out of there, and our team is okay. Our team will save us from the other team. And that choosing one person to have power over the largest government in history over the other one is going to destroy democracy. He's an evil dictator, whatever. And then choosing the other person, no matter who they are, is going to save it. When you add all of that together, the only thing we should be surprised at so far is that we haven't had more political violence by supporters of these factions than we've seen so far. Thomas Gordon, back to his works of Sallust, put it like this. He said, "Thus a country comes to be rent into factions. Thus factions hate one another implicitly and shun one another like plagues. They find nicknames for one another, then love or detest these nicknames and all that bear them. They herd in cabals, there chiefly to extol their own side and abuse the other, to adore their own chiefs as demigods, and to revile the opposite as demons." I mean, one only needs to listen to a lot of podcasts in order to hear this kind of thing. It doesn't matter which team it is. The other team is a bunch of evil Nazis or whatever it may be. They're socialist monsters, they're murderers, they're enemies. And this is the language that is used all the time, and it is a result of centralized power devolving into rule by faction. Anyways, Gordon continued. He said, they consider the different party as determined enemies, then abhor and curse them as such. For it is natural to grow enemies to our enemies. And against an enemy, everything is lawful. All sorts of falsehood, calumny, and violence. So when you are in a situation where you're ruled by faction and people are calling them all kinds of things, the opponents all kinds of things, people are going to be driven to thinking like, this is an enemy of my country. It's my duty to protect my country. I will have to do whatever it takes. Again, we shouldn't be surprised that things seem to be teetering on the brink more and more year in and year out. This combination of massive centralized power that shouldn't exist, a constitution relentlessly ignored to the tune of giving us the largest government in the history of the world, plus the natural propensity of human beings to just divide into factions, to pick a team in such a situation, and then the rhetoric that goes with it. The you're either with us or you're our enemy mentality of most people today. And as long as that continues, I think things are only going to get worse. But Noah Webster gave us the solution. So did George Washington. It was kind of implied in a lot of what he was saying there. Do not support usurpations of power, ever. But here's how Noah Webster put it in 1794. He said, "Americans, do not be deluded. In seeking liberty, France has gone beyond her. You, my countrymen, if you love liberty, adhere to your constitution of government. The moment you quit that sheet anchor, you are afloat among the surges of passion and the rocks of error, threatened every moment with shipwreck. Whether you like the powers delegated in the Constitution, whether you think it should be more or less, whether you hate them, it doesn't matter. As soon as government is unmoored from that sheet anchor, as Noah Webster described it, you are in a situation where you're going to devolve into the scenario of faction and power and control. Now, it's important to note that the founders' plan for enforcing the Constitution when government refuses to follow the rules, which for us, again, is constant 24/7, 365, it has nothing to do with trying to convince the government to stop doing what the government was never supposed to do in the first place. It has nothing to do with trying to find new people to run the largest government in the history. It's got nothing to do with trying to get one part of the government to tell the other part of the government to stop doing what they were never supposed to do in the first place. It's all about the people and the states enforcing the Constitution, whether the federal government likes it or not. And I've covered that in some detail in one of, I think, our most important episodes of this show, Constitution 101 Enforcement Mechanism. That's up on the screen here. It'll also be linked to in the show notes at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. And I'm not sure who needs to hear this message, but I think we all need to hear this over and over and over, especially Washington's warning. And that's why we work so hard every single day here at the 10th Amendment Center to get this important foundational information from the founders and the old revolutionaries out to more and more people. And there is absolutely nothing that helps us roll up our sleeves every day and get this job done more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat, please consider throwing it our way over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Our membership program starts out at just $2 a month. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. You can make a one-time donation at 10thamendmentcenter.com/donate. Whatever works for you works awesome for us. If you're not financially able to do that right now, no pressure, but if you are, I'd be very grateful for any consideration you can give to joining us today. 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I'll take a look over in the live chat a little bit later today and see if there's any comments or questions I can get back to. I get so much great feedback, so much help on researching things. Sometimes I get some corrections on what I'm talking about in the comments. The community here is just incredible. We're growing slowly but surely, and I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. More important than anything, I hope it made you think, and I hope you learned something. I hope you had an awesome weekend, and I look forward to seeing you next time here on the Path to Liberty.